Hi, I'm Kit Marlowe, and I'm reading from my novel, The Mangrove Legacy. And I'm going to just jump right into the middle of the action. Alice, Lizzie said, softly stealing a glance at the door. I have a secret to share with you. Oh, I love secrets, Alice crowed. Tell me, is it about the handsome young man we spotted talking to Mr. Bennet at the assembly ball last month? Lizzie regarded her cousin with puzzlement. Why on earth should it be about him? No, it's about this letter. Oh. Alice had entertained many pleasing thoughts about the still nameless young man in the idle weeks since. Oh, it's not from Arthur Boyle, she continued with dismay. She knew her father had leaned in his direction as far as her suitors went, and was very cross to imagine that she may indeed have to marry the dull young man. Alice, her cousin said, rousing her from a growing despondency, not everything is about you. This letter is actually from, and she paused to ascertain again that they were alone in the library, then whispered, from the King of Naples. Alice paused thoughtfully. Africa? We paid Miss Travers far too well, Lizzie said, frowning as Alice's father was also apt to do when speaking of the recently sacked tutor. No, Alice. Naples is in Italy. Ah, the King of Naples. Lizzie cocked an eyebrow at her younger cousin. Why is a king writing to you? Alice asked at last. Lizzie smiled. Alice had long ago noticed that when this happened, Lizzie looked very cunning indeed. It was most unbecoming in a lady. We've worked out a plan to... Just then the door of the library flew open, and a very flustered Mrs. Perkins shot into the room again. Oh, Miss Alice, she sobbed. Come quick, your mother needs you. What is it, Mrs. Perkins? Lizzie said, somewhat cross at having her own revelation upstaged. Mrs. Perkins was wringing her hands as she blurted, It's your father, Miss Alice. He's dead. Dead, said Alice with wonder. Dead, Mrs. Perkins was adamant. Are you sure? Lizzie asked. After all, Lord Mangrove had been a man of legendary silences, and Lizzie was to be forgiven the doubts that prompted such an otherwise impertinent question. There was a time not 5 years past when Lord Mangrove had gone without more than a harumph for over 6 months. At that time, Lord and Lady Mangrove had come to some rather ineffective disagreements about a parlour-maid. It was perhaps the worst of their silent struggles, but it was far from the only one. Mrs. Perkins, however, was not to be dissuaded. Oh, child, I hate to give you the news in such a terrible manner, she flustered, offering a perfunctory half-curtsy. It's all right, Alice soothed. I hardly know what to feel. I do feel extremely odd and a bit queerly dizzy. You must sit at once, Mrs. Perkins and Lizzie said in tandem, both fearing that perhaps the young woman was about to faint. Alice followed their advice, collapsing into a sensible pine library chair. Dead! Her father was dead. Perhaps, Alice thought excitedly, she would not have to marry Mr. Boyle at all. And how is Lady Mangrove? Lizzie asked the faithful servant. She's rather shocked, as you might imagine, miss, Mrs. Perkins said, although Lizzie thought perhaps she was not offering the entire truth. What happened, Mrs. Perkins? Lizzie demanded, artfully pulling out a second chair for the weary servant. Tell us from beginning to end. Mrs. Perkins sank into the proffered chair, and a rough hand rubbed her troubled brow. It was a most peculiar thing, she began. Not that people go dying every day, child. Oh, and my greatest, most humble sorrow for your loss, miss. She seemed on the verge of rising once more, if only to curtsy, but Lizzie restrained her with a gentle gesture that belied her growing impatience with the strange mystery. Go on, Mrs. Perkins, Lizzie encouraged. How did it begin? Start there, then go to the end, then stop. Mrs. Perkins drew in a breath. I was just about to get to the kitchen, 1,000,001 things to do, as you well might guess. Not that such work should be any worry of fine young ladies like yourselves, she added, patting Alice's soft white hand. All of a sudden I heard a horrible sound, like a wild bird's squawk or something. African or European? Lizzie asked, but Alice shushed her with a wave of the hand, and bade Mrs. Perkins to go on. I rushed to the door of the morning-room, and there such a sight awaited me. Your father, Miss Alice, was lying on the floor in a most peculiar disarray, arms clutching at the air, legs in the most ungainly crouching position, but him flat on his back like a puppy. Alice thought of the image and could not quite hide a smile. It must have looked most curious, she finally said, coughing a little to cover up her involuntary merriment. Her cousin, she noticed, did not grin, but looked ever more intently at Mrs. Perkins. The shocked housekeeper did not notice Alice's inappropriate mirth, but continued with her tragic tale. Your mother looked up from her needlepoint with a most shocked appearance, and her hands frozen in the air as if unable to move. until I finally gasped, and your mother at last said, and I shall always remember, these terrible words. Mrs. Perkins, I believe something has happened to my husband. Truer words were never spoken, she added with a shudder. And are you sure, that is, have you truly ascertained that he is dead? Lizzie said gently. I've sent young Master Spigot for the doctor. We shall know soon enough now, Mrs. Perkins intoned sagely. Her composure returned. Suddenly there was a loud crash and a scream in the hall. Heavens, said Lizzie, forgetting all propriety in the shock of the moment. What can that be? Alice stared at her, thunderstruck. She had never heard the word out loud with such a charged tone, yet the sound had been startling. The three of them were just turning towards the door when it flew open once again to reveal Janet, the scullery maid, breathless and red-faced. It's your mother, she squeaked. While her addressee was uncertain, Alice had no doubt that she herself had been meant. Lizzie's mother was 7 years dead, and Mrs. Perkins, well, honestly, she had no idea whether Mrs. Perkins had a mother living or dead. Certainly, a mother she must have had, Alice corrected her wandering thoughts. Surely a mother. But she realized that she had never once inquired about Mrs. Perkins' mother, alive or dead, and was conscious once more, fleetingly, of how cavalierly she treated the trustworthy woman who had ordered her life since before birth. I shall do better, Alice swore to herself, a promise quickly forgotten in the ensuing hours, yet one we really ought to honor her for. Alice rightly began to consider whether her disordered thoughts were perhaps the result of all the shocks. After all, she could only assume the worst. Her mother, too, was dead, perhaps? And while to lose one parent might be considered a distinct misfortune, she was quite certain that to lose both would leave her out of all sympathy, as someone who ought to have taken better care of her predecessors. Janet, however, clarified her initial remark to the relief of all three women, who evidently had been thinking along similar lines. She has discharged your father's pistol. All three of her addressees breathed a sigh of relief. Lizzie was the first to recover herself. Why on earth did she do such a thing? She demanded of the trembling maid. Surely not. And the horrible conclusion that presented itself to the wise young woman fortunately escaped her struggling cousin for the moment. Young Janet was quick to restore equilibrium. Oh, no, miss, the clever maid assured her lady. It was only on account of the young man. She meant no harm. Young man? Said Alice with a great deal of curiosity. What young man? Why, Mr. Borlet, of course, Janet finished, turning to her young mistress with a hint of a smile. Mr. Borlet was a great favourite among the house staff, for he generally dropped large amounts of coinage from his pocket as he made his way awkwardly through the house. He was less than a favourite of Alice's, however, as may already be plain. But my mother is all right, Alice asked somewhat peevishly. It would have to be tiresome old Arthur who caused such a fuss, just when she was thinking she would be free of him. Your mother is a bit bewildered and a trifle deaf, Janet continued. The doctor is already on his way, so he will be able to determine the extent of her hearing loss. Begging your pardon, miss, Janet said with a hasty curtsy. We're so sorry to hear of your loss. Thank you, Janet, Alice replied with great gravity. The shock of her father's death had not yet reached her heart, although it had begun to sink into the relatively calm, still, and shallow waters of her mind. How did my father pass away? We are sorely pressed for details. Lizzie nodded agreement. We should like to know more about what happened. This is all so sudden. Janet nodded sadly in agreement. I had just brought him his daily tincture of arsenic, when he simply keeled over all of a sudden. It was like a bolt from the blue. Lizzie was about to bring forth her pet theory that arsenic, far from being the tonic her uncle assumed, was in fact extremely dangerous, when a figure, pale as a spectre, peered from the half-open door of the library and whispered weedily, Alice, Alice. The women turned and gasped. Oh, for heaven's sake, Alice said daringly. What is it, Arthur? Alice's lack of compassion for the young man was understandable, perhaps, given her strong likelihood of being married to him in the very near future. But surely the sight of his pale visage peering around the door would have stirred the sympathies of any heart not already obdurate to his welfare. Of course, a conversation of even 5 minutes would easily have remedied that initial stirring, for Arthur Borlet was an inveterate bore. There was no subject on which he could not wax mind-numbingly, tediously dull, and most subjects of his choosing inclined sharply in the direction of boring. Land management schemes, tax redundancies, and the obscure minutiae of the lives of long-dead kings. Alice could scarcely conceal her tendency to yawn when Arthur got going on the effects of adding furrows to increase drainage, or spoke at length on Edward the Confessor's collection of holy relics and spoons. However, this time Arthur managed to be brief. Is the doctor on his way? He exhaled wearily. Janet was the first to answer, which was handy, as she was the only one with first-hand knowledge of the issue. "Yes, sir," Janet said with another little curtsy. "He should be here directly." "Oughtn't you be sitting down, Mr. Boylett?" Rather than respond, Arthur simply sank to the floor. As he fell, his arm flew out, revealing a rather large stain of blood that had soaked through his shirt. Alice gasped, and Lizzie once again blurted, "Heavens!" I hope you enjoyed that, and if you do, you might want to pick up The Mangrove Legacy. Thanks.